You've probably never heard of Napoleon Bonaparte. Even if you don't know much about him, you've probably seen the hat, the weird hand in the coat pose, and maybe heard that he was this really short French guy who got angry and decided to conquer Europe. The funny thing is, Napoleon wasn't actually that short. He was around 5'6" or 5'7", which wasn't unusual for a Frenchman at the time. The British loved making fun of him, so their cartoons often showed Napoleon as this tiny little angry guy, and somehow that joke has survived for more than 200 years. But honestly, they didn't need to make things up, because Napoleon's real life was already pretty weird. This is a guy who grew up on the island of Corsica, became a general while he was still in his 20s, lost most of his army, got exiled to an island, and escaped the island, became emperor again. Oh, and he was once attacked by rabbits. So, yeah, we've got a lot to talk about. Napoleon was born in Corsica in 1769. Napoleon wasn't born into some powerful Parisian family. He was actually kind of an outsider. When he went to school in France, he spoke with a Corsican accent because Corsica had only recently come under French control. Some of the other students apparently made fun of him for his accent. He eventually went into the military, though, and became an artillery officer, which meant he was really good at mathematics and understanding how cannons worked. That's when the French Revolution happened. France basically went insane for a while. The monarchy collapsed, war broke out, and the governments changed. For Napoleon, this was an opportunity. He proved himself during the siege of Toulon, becoming a general in his 20s, and then won some incredible victories in Italy. Napoleon was genuinely good at warfare. He wasn't magically unbeatable, even though some may say he was, and he didn't invent every tactic that he used. But he was extremely good at moving armies quickly and attacking enemies before they could properly organize themselves. By 1799, Napoleon helped overthrow the French government. Then, in 1804, he became Emperor of France. He was only 35 years old at the time. Imagine being one of those kids who made fun of his accent at school and then finding out that kid is now the emperor. I would not have wanted to have made fun of him. Before Napoleon became emperor, he did something that seemed a little random at first. He invaded, of all places, Egypt. Apparently, there was actual reason for invading Egypt. France was fighting Britain at the time, and Napoleon hoped controlling Egypt could threaten Britain's trade connections with India. Here's the unusual part. That's not already unusual enough. Napoleon didn't just bring soldiers, he brought scientists. Yeah, and no, this is not some episode of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. More than 150 scientists, engineers, artists, and other experts went along with the French expedition. Sort of Indiana Jones hunt. They studied animals, plants, geography, ancient buildings, and basically anything else they could find. It was almost like Napoleon brought an entire school field trip with his invading army. And then, something really important happened. In 1799, French soldiers found a strange stone near the town of Rosetta. It had writings carved into it in 3 different scripts, including ancient Greek and Egyptian hieroglyphs. Yeah, that Rosetta Stone. The Egyptian campaign didn't go according to plan. Even with finding this monumental translating tool, the Egyptian campaign didn't exactly go according to plan. The British destroyed much of Napoleon's fleet he had left at the water, and the French eventually had to leave Egypt, and British ended up taking the Rosetta Stone that the French had found. But the stone eventually helped scholars figure out how to read Egyptian hieroglyphs, along with other languages. So Napoleon went to Egypt, hoping to hurt Britain. Britain defeated him and took the stone. And somehow, the whole thing helped us understand ancient Egypt. History gets weird like that. Okay, we need to talk about the rabbits. Napoleon's chief of staff, Alexander Berthier, once organized a rabbit hunt for Napoleon and some of his guests. The plan was pretty simple. Get a bunch of rabbits, release them into a field, and Napoleon and his friends would hunt them. Except, somebody apparently made a pretty big mistake. They got domesticated rabbits. I know what you're thinking. Domesticated rabbits? When the rabbits were released, they didn't see Napoleon and think, "Oh no, humans! Run!" They basically thought, "Oh look, humans! Food!" So the rabbits charged them. At first, Napoleon and his friends apparently thought this was funny. Then the rabbits kept coming. They surrounded Napoleon, ran around his legs, and reportedly chased him and his companions back toward their carriages. Napoleon Bonaparte had fought some of the most powerful armies in Europe, but against several hundred hungry rabbits, Napoleon retreated. And I don't even have anything else to add to that, honestly. Now we get back to the serious part. Napoleon kept winning wars, and eventually, his empire and allies controlled or influenced huge portions of Europe. But there's a problem with conquering lots of places. You have to keep them after conquering them. Spain became a nightmare for Napoleon because French troops faced not only regular enemy armies but also local guerrilla fighters who could attack French soldiers and supply lines and then just simply disappear. Napoleon could win a major battle and still have thousands of people resisting French rule afterward. And this was starting to become a pattern. Napoleon had proved he was pretty good at defeating armies. Controlling everything afterwards was a little bit harder. Then, in 1812, he decided to invade Russia. And this is where everything started going very wrong. You've probably heard that Napoleon invaded Russia, and then the winter destroyed his army. That's true, but there's also a huge problem with that version. Napoleon's army was already falling apart before the really bad winter weather arrived. Napoleon entered Russia with an enormous army made up of soldiers from France and many other parts of Europe. And when I say enormous, we're talking hundreds of thousands of people. Now think about feeding that many people. Yeah. And then think about feeding all their horses every single day. Napoleon needed wagons filled with food and supplies to follow his army across hundreds of miles of Russian territory, often using terrible roads. There was no GPS back then. Meanwhile, the Russian army kept pulling farther back into retreat. Napoleon wanted a giant battle where he could simply wipe them off the map all in one fell swoop. But the Russians had other ideas. The farther Napoleon went, the longer his supply lines became. Soldiers became exhausted, food became harder to find, and horses started dying. This was all happening before winter. And now we meet one of Napoleon's grossest enemies, lice. Napoleon's soldiers were absolutely covered in them, which makes sense when you think about it. These were huge groups of men living pretty close together, wearing the same uniforms for months, and marching through places where proper bathing wasn't exactly accessible. But lice weren't just gross, they could actually spread disease. Typhus had traditionally been connected with Napoleon's Russian campaign, and modern studies of remains associated with the retreat have found evidence of other illnesses, including louse-borne relapsing fever. Napoleon's doctors didn't know about bacteria. Germ theory wouldn't be properly developed until later in the 19th century. So, as a result, these soldiers were getting sick, sometimes horribly sick, and their doctors didn't fully understand why. Think about how bizarre that is. Napoleon could look across a battlefield, study an enemy army, and figure out where to attack it. But he couldn't see the enemy living inside his soldiers' clothing. And these tiny parasites were helping spread disease through one of the largest armies Europe had ever seen. Napoleon eventually fought the Russians at Borodino and won a horribly expensive victory before entering Moscow. He expected the Russians to negotiate after that, but they didn't. Much of Moscow burned, supplies were limited, and Napoleon basically sat there waiting for a peace deal that never came. Eventually, he had to leave. And now, the winter really did become a huge problem. Temperatures dropped, soldiers froze, horses died. And not to mention the food was kind of disappearing. Russian forces and Cossacks kept attacking the retreating army, but this is why saying winter defeated Napoleon doesn't really tell the whole story. Winter attacked an army that was already extinguished, basically everything went wrong at once. If your horses die, you can't move your supplies. If you can't move your supplies, your soldiers don't eat. If your soldiers don't eat, they become weaker. And if they're weak and sick, they're much more vulnerable to the cold. So while all of this is happening, the Russian army is still trying to kill you. So yeah, the Russian winter helped destroy Napoleon's army. But it had plenty of help as well. Somehow, Napoleon came back. Napoleon was utterly defeated. He gave up the throne in 1814 and sent him into exile on Elba, which is a small island in the Mediterranean Sea. Normally, this would be where someone's story ended. But, it's Napoleon. And apparently, Napoleon disagreed with this little exile. He managed to escape Elba. He sailed back to France, landed with a relatively small group of supporters, and started moving towards Paris. The French government sent soldiers to arrest him upon hearing word that he had arrived in Paris, but instead, many of those same soldiers joined Napoleon. That's how persuasive Napoleon was, and that's really one of the hidden talents and secret weapons that made him so powerful. I can't imagine how annoying this must have been for the rest of Europe. I mean, they had spent years fighting this guy. They finally defeated him. They put him on an island, and then somebody basically had to walk into the room and say, guys, Napoleon's back. So, yeah, Napoleon was kind of like a Tai Lung of the early 18th century. Napoleon's comeback lasted about 3 months. On June 18th, 1815, he fought his major battle near Waterloo against an Anglo-Allied army commanded by the Duke of Wellington, while a Prussian army under Blücher was also approaching. And it turned out that one of Napoleon's worst enemies was weather, because heavy rain had turned parts of the battlefield into mud. Napoleon's forces attacked Wellington's position, but Wellington held long enough for the Prussians to arrive in increasing numbers. By the end of the day, Napoleon's army was collapsed. This time, everyone had learned their lesson. Napoleon was exiled again, except instead of putting him on a little Mediterranean island relatively close to France, the British sent him to St. Helena. St. Helena is way out in the South Atlantic. Napoleon wasn't escaping from this one. He died there in 1821 at 51 years old. I think the strangest thing about Napoleon is that we don't really need to exaggerate his life. He wasn't super short. He wasn't defeated only because Russia got cold. He wasn't some magical military genius who could never make mistakes. The actual person? I think he's way more interesting. Napoleon went from being a Corsican kid with an accent to the freaking Emperor of France. He invaded Egypt with scientists, like someone out of JoJo's Bizarre Adventures, and accidentally became connected with the discovery of the Rosetta Stone. Conquered huge parts of Europe, got chased away by rabbits, and his enormous army marched into Russia, which was slowly destroyed by fighting, distance, and lice. He was defeated, he got exiled, he escaped, he became the emperor again, then he lost at Waterloo, and got sent to an island so ridiculously far away that escaping wasn't really an option anymore. And I think that's what makes Napoleon interesting. History likes turning people into simpler characters, more black and white. Napoleon becomes the short, angry conqueror, but actual human beings are almost never that simple. Sometimes they're brilliant, sometimes they're cruel, sometimes they make terrible decisions. If you enjoyed this episode of Untold and Unusual, consider subscribing, because there are plenty more people throughout history who become a whole lot weirder once you actually start looking at them. Thanks for watching.